Under the blistering Nevada sun, two Hollywood legends, Keanu Reeves and Harrison Ford, spot an overturned car in the middle of the desert. No signal, no help. For miles, just smoke, blood, and fading breaths. In that moment, fame means nothing. What they do next will test not their strength, but their humanity. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly beneath the punishing sun, a place where even sound seemed to evaporate. The air shimmered like molten glass, distorting the horizon into trembling mirages. Dust swirled in tiny whirlwinds across the cracked highway that ran between the mountains and the open plains. By noon, the heat had reached the kind of intensity that could melt the resolve of anyone not born for endurance. But for Keanu Reeves, the desert's silence was its own kind of music. He had just finished another grueling morning of filming a demanding chase scene for a neo-Western film shot miles outside of Tonopah. The director called for lunch, and the crew began retreating toward the shade of production tents. But Keanu didn't move with them. He took off his hat, ran a hand through his sweat-damp hair, and looked toward the horizon. He wanted to breathe something that wasn't artificial, something untouched by generators, makeup powder, and radio chatter. The open desert called to him the way an old song does, pulling him away from the noise of set life. Harrison Ford was there too, standing beside an old Jeep Wrangler the studio had rented for him. He looked out across the dunes, his weathered face unreadable behind a pair of aviator sunglasses. When Keanu approached, he smirked lightly. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Harrison asked. Keanu's answer was simple. A small, knowing smile as he gestured toward two motorcycles parked beside a lighting truck. They were his custom Arch and Harrison's rugged BMW GS Adventure. "Let's get lost for a while," Keanu said. The crew tried to convince them to wait until later. The afternoon heat was brutal, and the desert wasn't forgiving. But the two men, both veterans of life's extremes, just nodded to each other, strapped on their helmets, and rolled out. The engines roared to life, breaking the stillness like thunder across an empty sky. The road cut through valleys of red stone and fields of silver dust. The only movement came from tumbleweeds drifting lazily across the asphalt. The deeper they rode, the smaller the world behind them became. Keanu's black riding jacket rippled in the wind as he leaned into the curves, eyes fixed on the horizon. For him, this was the kind of freedom that fame could never buy. The sound of the engine, the sting of sand against his gloves, the reminder that he was still human beneath the legend. Beside him, Harrison rode with steady control, his posture upright and sure, a man at peace with both time and the machine beneath him. The ride reminded him of younger days, movie sets in distant deserts, long flights in his own plane, and the quiet understanding that solitude could heal what fame often broke. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. In that searing heat, beneath a sky wide enough to swallow the world, two men from different eras shared the same truth. Some silences speak louder than applause. The farther they rode, the less the world seemed to exist. The asphalt turned to worn gravel, then to dirt and pale sand. The horizon blurred, dissolving into streaks of gold and gray. It was the kind of landscape that humbled anyone, actors, farmers, soldiers alike. Here, there were no cameras, no fans, no fame, just endurance. Keanu slowed his bike as they reached a ridge that overlooked miles of unbroken desert. He cut the engine and lifted his visor, breathing in the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was absolute. The kind of stillness that presses against your chest until you feel your own heartbeat. He looked over at Harrison, who had parked beside him, both engines ticking as they cooled in the heat. "Feels like another planet," Keanu said, his voice half lost in the dry wind. Harrison gave a slow grin. "You spend long enough in Hollywood, you start to miss places like this. Places that don't care who you are." They stood there a while, letting the desert wind sweep past. Heat shimmered on the dunes, like the breath of an invisible fire. Keanu squinted toward the distant horizon, a faint feeling tugging at his chest, something he couldn't quite name. Or fate stirring. When they finally started their bikes again, they rode in silence for miles. The rhythmic hum of engines became a kind of meditation. Each mile took them deeper into isolation, far beyond the range of the production crew's radios. The road narrowed, twisting through patches of broken rock and sand that looked like forgotten battlefields. Every once in a while, Keanu would glance toward Harrison, making sure they kept close. Despite the decades between them, their movements were in perfect rhythm, two men shaped by instinct, not ego. The kind of bond only built through experience. Harrison gestured at a faded sign half buried in sand. Next gas, 42 miles. He shook his head with a smirk. Hope you filled up. Keanu laughed lightly. I always do. But beneath that laughter was a deep sense of presence. The desert had a way of stripping life down to its essentials: heat, dust, and breath. And for men who had both lived lives larger than most, that simplicity felt grounding. The sun climbed higher, turning everything into liquid gold. Time began to stretch. They could have been out there for an hour, or for a lifetime, it didn't matter. Every turn of the wheels carried a quiet kind of peace. Then, in the distance, a faint glint caught Keanu's eye. Metallic, out of place against the sand's dull shimmer. He narrowed his eyes through the visor, unsure if it was a mirage or something real. Harrison noticed it too, and slowed down, pointing toward the strange reflection. Keanu lifted his hand to signal a stop. The air around them pulsed with heat, thick and restless. They hadn't planned to find anything out here. But sometimes, the desert reveals what it's been hiding when you least expect it. Keanu eased his motorcycle to the side of the road, dust rising around his boots as he came to a stop. The shimmering light ahead flickered again, like a mirror flashing under the sun. He pulled off his helmet, letting the hot wind sting his face. Harrison slowed to a halt beside him, removing his own helmet, his eyes narrowing as he followed the reflection's source. Could be junk, Harrison muttered, shielding his face with a gloved hand. Or trouble. Keanu didn't answer immediately. He studied the horizon carefully, scanning for movement. The glint came from beyond a shallow ridge, a stretch of desert that dipped suddenly into a small basin. The kind of place no one should have been driving through, not without knowing the terrain. His gut told him it wasn't just metal. It was something worse. Let's check it out, Keanu finally said. His tone was calm, but there was a certain gravity in it, the kind that left no room for debate. They kicked their bikes back into motion, the engines growling across the brittle surface of sand and stone. The ride down the ridge was rough, the heat pressing against their backs like a living weight. The metallic flash grew brighter with each yard they covered, until its shape began to form something large, something curved. Then the air shifted. A faint, acrid scent reached them. Burnt rubber, oil, gasoline. Keanu's pulse quickened. He could feel the adrenaline rising beneath his calm exterior, the way it always did in moments where instinct mattered more than thought. Harrison leaned forward slightly, squinting ahead. That's no mirage, he said under his breath. They came to a stop on the edge of the basin. Below them, half buried in sand, lay an overturned SUV. The front end was crushed, one tire still spinning faintly in the wind. The desert around it was eerily quiet, except for the faint pop of cooling metal. Keanu's throat tightened. He scanned the wreck for movement. Nothing at first. Then, through the cracked windshield, a flicker, to an arm, twitching. Someone was inside. He looked at Harrison, who was already climbing off his bike. There was no hesitation in either of them. Fame, age, cameras all meaningless now. There were people who needed help and no one else around for miles. The heat seemed to vanish from Keanu's awareness. He unzipped his jacket, tossed it aside, and started running toward the wreck. Harrison was right behind him, shouting something about fuel leakage. But Keanu was already there, kneeling in the dust, peering through the shattered glass. Two figures inside. A man in the driver's seat, slumped and motionless. A woman on the passenger side, her head tilted back, a smear of blood across her temple. The sight hit Keanu like a wave, raw, urgent, human. He reached for the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. The metal had twisted inward from the crash. He stepped back, scanning for leverage. Behind him, Harrison arrived, breathing hard, already assessing the damage with quick, practiced eyes. "Looks bad," Harrison said. "We've got minutes before that fuel cooks in the sun." Keanu nodded once. "Then, we don't waste them." The desert had tested many men before. That day, it was about to test two more. The first thing Keanu noticed was the smell. It hit him before the sound, the sharp chemical sting of leaking gasoline, mixed with the hot scent of burnt rubber. The overturned SUV was on its side, half buried in soft sand that had absorbed part of the impact. The windshield was shattered, its glass scattered across the ground like ice shards catching the sunlight. A faint column of smoke rose from under the hood, wavering in the heavy air. Keanu didn't hesitate. He tossed his gloves to the ground and ran toward the wreckage, boots sliding slightly in the sand. Harrison shouted something behind him, something about keeping an eye on the leaking fuel. But Keanu was already kneeling beside the passenger door, peering through the fractured window. Inside, the scene was chaos. A man was slumped over the steering wheel, his face pale, blood streaking down his temple. The woman beside him, her seatbelt twisted around her torso, was barely conscious. She tried to lift her head but couldn't. "Stay with me," Keanu said quietly, pressing his hand against the shattered frame. His tone was steady, firm, the kind that reassures rather than alarms. He could see that her breathing was shallow, uneven. Every second counted. Harrison arrived seconds later, already pulling off his jacket. "We need to get them out before that thing lights up," he said, nodding toward the hood. The faint smoke was thickening, curling upward in lazy spirals. The sun's reflection off the metal made the wreck shimmer like it was burning already. Keanu tried the door handle. It was jammed tight. He tugged harder, bracing his foot against the sand. Nothing. The metal had folded in on itself. He glanced around quickly, spotting a tire iron half buried near the back wheel, probably ejected from the car during the crash. He grabbed it, wedged it between the door frame and the bent hinge, and began prying with all his strength. The sound of bending steel scraped through the air. Harrison leaned over to help, his gloved hands gripping the edge of the door. Together, they heaved, muscles straining, sweat pouring down their faces. The door gave a sudden groan, then popped open an inch. Keanu shoved his shoulder against it and forced it wide enough to reach inside. The woman gasped weakly, her eyes fluttering open. Her lips trembled as if to speak, but no words came out. "Don't move," Keanu told her softly. "You're going to be okay. We've got you." He reached in and carefully unbuckled her seatbelt, supporting her neck with his arm as Harrison steadied the frame from the outside. Behind them, the smell of gas was getting stronger. The breeze shifted, carrying the heat toward the hood. Harrison looked up sharply. "Keanu, we need to move fast," he said. His jaw tightened. There was no time to wait for help. Keanu braced himself, lowering his body to reach further inside the SUV. The woman's skin was pale, streaked with dust and blood. Her breathing was uneven, but her pulse when he checked her wrist was still there, faint but steady. He could feel her trembling. Every instinct told him they didn't have much time before the heat and fumes turned this rescue into something worse. Harrison crouched on the other side, inspecting the driver's seat. The man's head rested awkwardly against the deflated airbag. His left arm twisted in a way that looked wrong. "He's still breathing," Harrison said, his voice tight. "But that leg's trapped. I'll need leverage." Keanu looked around quickly, scanning the ground for anything that could help. His eyes landed on a long piece of metal, a broken road sign that had been torn loose by the impact. He grabbed it and handed it to Harrison. "Use this," he said. "I'll get her out first." The heat was unbearable now. The desert sun pressed down like a furnace, baking the metal surface of the SUV. Sweat ran down Keanu's neck and soaked through his shirt. He worked carefully but quickly, freeing the woman's seatbelt, then sliding one arm behind her shoulders. She winced as he moved her, a soft cry escaping her lips. "I know," he murmured. "I'm sorry. You're going to be fine. Just breathe." Harrison jammed the metal bar under the crushed dashboard, his muscles flexing as he tried to lift it enough to free the man's trapped leg. The effort made his jaw tighten, veins rising in his forearm. "Almost there," he grunted. The sound of shifting steel echoed through the desert air. Keanu pulled the woman through the open door, her body limp in his arms. He carried her a few feet away and laid her down on a patch of sand, propping her head gently on his rolled-up jacket. Her eyes flickered open again, glassy but aware. "My husband," she whispered hoarsely. "Please." Keanu looked back toward the car. "He's coming. Don't worry." The wind picked up, tossing dust into their eyes. It stung, but neither man slowed. Harrison strained once more against the bar, and with a loud crack, the metal gave way. The driver's leg came free. "Got him!" Harrison called. Keanu ran back, helping to pull the man from the wreck. His weight was heavy, his body limp, but there was still life in him. A shallow rhythm of breath that gave them both relief. They dragged him several feet from the SUV and laid him beside his wife. Then Keanu heard it, the faint crackle from under the hood. He turned his head sharply, eyes narrowing. A thin wisp of black smoke curled upward from the engine compartment. The air shimmered with heat, carrying the smell of burning oil. Harrison noticed it too. "That's the start of a fire," he said, already reaching for his backpack. "We've got minutes, maybe less." Keanu knelt beside the woman again, shielding her from the wind. "Stay awake," he said softly. "Help's coming. Just keep breathing." But as he looked up at the horizon, there was nothing but empty road and silence. The smoke thickened, rising from beneath the crumpled hood in short, angry bursts. Keanu moved closer, crouching low to peer under the frame. The faint hiss of leaking fuel reached his ears. One spark was all it would take to turn this desert hollow into an inferno. He turned back toward Harrison, who was kneeling by the unconscious man, checking his pulse again. "We need to move them farther," Keanu said firmly. "Now." Harrison nodded, without hesitation. Together they lifted the man, each taking one side, careful not to jolt his injuries, and carried him another 20 yards downwind from the wreck. The woman was still conscious, her hand weakly reaching toward where she thought her husband was. Keanu returned for her, speaking softly as he slid his arms under her shoulders. "He's safe. You're safe too." She tried to form words, but the sound came out as a faint rasp lost to the wind. He set her beside her husband, placing a jacket beneath her head and another over her chest. The desert might have been blazing, but the human body in shock could still shiver under heat. He poured a small cap of water from his flask and let a few drops touch her lips. She stirred, faintly, eyes flickering open. For a second, they locked eyes, hers wide with confusion and fear, his calm and steady, an anchor in the chaos. Behind them, Harrison moved toward the SUV, scanning for anything flammable that might make things worse. "It's leaking from the tank," he called out. "If it catches, it's going up fast." Keanu jogged back toward the wreck, his boots crunching over broken glass. He reached in through the shattered window to switch off the ignition, just in case there was still current running. The metal burned his palm, but he didn't flinch. He stepped back, breathing hard, watching the hood tremble as smoke forced its way through the seams. Harrison joined him, wiping his brow. "We need to back off," he said quietly. They retreated together, the fire's faint crackle following them. Once they reached the injured couple again, Keanu knelt between them. The woman was whispering something too faint to hear. He leaned closer until her breath touched his ear. "Don't let him go," she murmured. "I won't," Keanu promised. He reached across and took the man's wrist, feeling for that fragile rhythm again. It was still there, but fading. The man's chest rose and fell in uneven waves, every breath a struggle. Keanu looked at Harrison. He needs help soon. Harrison's face was grim. "No signal out here. You'll have to ride for it." Keanu looked toward the horizon, that endless stretch of barren highway. It could have been 20 miles, maybe more, before a single bar of service appeared. He knew what it meant. Time, distance, risk. But there was no hesitation in his eyes. He tightened the strap of his glove, stood, and nodded once. "Keep them alive," Keanu said quietly. Harrison gave a small, firm nod. "Go!" Keanu turned toward his motorcycle, the desert sun glaring against the chrome, and swung his leg over the seat. The engine roared to life, shattering the stillness. Dust swirled behind Tim as he sped away, one man racing the horizon, chasing a signal that meant the difference between life and death. The sound of the crackling engine grew louder, a harsh rhythm of heat and danger that echoed through the still desert air. Keanu could feel the pressure building in his chest. He knew that once the leaking fuel met the flames, the wreck could ignite in seconds. He looked back at the two victims lying in the sand, then toward Harrison, who was already moving fast, his instincts sharp and efficient despite the sweat glistening on his weathered face. From the side pouch of his motorcycle, Harrison pulled out a small red fire extinguisher. It was old, but well kept, something he had carried for years after a near-fatal fire on a movie set in the 90s. Without saying a word, he ran straight toward the SUV. The smoke burned his throat, but he pressed forward, yanking the pin and spraying the base of the hood in strong, deliberate bursts. The white foam hissed and spread over the metal, suffocating the growing heat. Keanu joined him, ducking low to the ground to reach through the pros, driver's side. The door creaked, warped by the crash, but he managed to pry it open enough to reach the man inside. The driver's arm was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, and his leg was pinned tightly under the crumpled console. Keanu braced his shoulder against the edge of the seat and pulled. The man groaned in pain, his eyelids flickering. Keanu could feel the strain in every muscle as he heaved with all his strength, trying to free the trapped leg. The smell of burnt plastic mixed with gasoline filled the air, stinging his eyes. Harrison shouted over the noise. "You almost have it! Just one more push!" Keanu shifted his weight, grabbed the man under his arms, and pulled again. This time, the metal gave way with a groan, releasing the leg. The man's body slumped forward, unconscious, but alive. Keanu eased him down gently, taking a moment to catch his breath. The heat radiating from the vehicle was unbearable now, but there was no time to think about comfort. He set in Bose, lifted the man by his shoulders, dragging him out of the wreck as Harrison came around to help. Together, they pulled him several yards away from the SUV and laid him beside his wife. The woman stirred weakly, her voice trembling. He's breathing," Keanu said, his tone calm and reassuring. "You're both safe for now." He tore off his denim jacket and wrapped it around her leg, where the blood had begun to seep through her jeans. The wound wasn't deep enough to be fatal, but the bleeding could worsen if left untreated. His hands worked quickly, steady, despite the heat and urgency. Harrison ripped a sleeve from his shirt and began fashioning a splint for the man's arm. He tore the fabric into strips, securing the limb tightly to prevent further damage. They didn't speak much, only exchanged short, clear looks, communication born from trust and necessity. The wind shifted, fanning the smoke toward them. The air grew thick and bitter, making it hard to breathe. Harrison stepped back from the wreck, wiping his forehead with his forearm, his chest rising and falling in heavy rhythm. "That's all I've got," he said, glancing at the extinguisher, now empty and hissing softly in the sand. Keanu looked back at the SUV. The foam held for a moment, then flickered. Beneath it, the orange glow of flame began to reappear, tiny at first but spreading along the edge of the engine block. He knew what was coming next. They had to move faster. He crouched beside the woman again, checking her pulse. It was stronger now, but still unsteady. Her breathing came in shallow bursts, eyes half open. Her lips cracked from the heat. "Stay with us," Keanu said softly. "You're going to be okay. Help is coming." The words were calm, but inside, he felt the ticking of time. The road behind them stretched for miles, empty, endless, and silent. Not even the faint hum of a passing car. The desert was an island, and they were alone in it. Harrison leaned over the man, tightening the makeshift splint around his arm. The driver groaned faintly, his head rolling toward his wife. The movement was small, but enough to send a jolt of hope through both men. "That's it," Harrison murmured. "That's good. Just keep breathing." A sudden pop came from the SUV. Both men turned. The sound was followed by a low rumble and a thin stream of fire bursting from the front wheel well. Keanu felt the shock wave of heat brush his face. "It's going up," Harrison said, voice low and urgent. Keanu moved quickly, dragging the two victims farther from the wreck. Harrison joined him, gripping the man under the shoulders as Keanu took the legs. The woman stirred weakly, her fingers brushing against Keanu's wrist. "Don't leave us," she whispered. He looked down at her. "We're not going anywhere," he promised. His tone was steady, but his heart was pounding. They set the couple down on a patch of rocky ground, at least 30 yards away. Behind them, the flames finally took hold. The SUV erupted in a burst of heat and sound, the windshield imploding, shards scattering like glass rain across the sand. A column of black smoke rose high into the air, twisting in the wind. For a long moment, neither man spoke. They just watched, faces streaked with dirt and sweat, the fire reflecting in their eyes. It wasn't triumph they felt, it was gravity, the sobering reality of how close those two lives had come to ending. Keanu pulled his phone from his pocket, staring at the blank screen. No bars, no signal, just the static emptiness of isolation. He turned it sideways, walked a few steps, tried again. Nothing. He looked toward the horizon, squinting against the sun. The nearest town was 20 miles, maybe more. The road shimmered in the distance, bending in the heat. He knew what he had to do. Keanu stood in the wavering heat, his jaw tight, sweat rolling down his temples. Behind him, the fire consumed what was left of the SUV, the flames crackling in bursts as metal warped and glass shattered. The sound echoed through the open desert like distant thunder. The couple lay side by side on the ground, both breathing but barely. He could see the color slowly returning to the woman's cheeks, but the man's pulse still felt weak under his fingertips. Harrison came up beside him, his voice steady but low. "They'll make it if we get help soon, but we're running out of daylight." Keanu looked down at his phone again. No signal. The screen felt useless in his hand. The silence around them was endless. No wind, no birds, not even the hum of insects. Just the burning wreck and the weight of responsibility pressing on his chest. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked at Harrison. "I'll find signal," he said quietly. "You stay with them." Harrison nodded once. No argument, just mutual understanding. He knew what it meant to take that kind of risk. He walked back to the grassed couple and knelt beside them. "I'll keep them stable," he said. "Go." Keanu moved toward his motorcycle. The metal was hot to the touch, but it didn't matter. He swung his leg over the seat, started the engine, and gave Harrison a quick nod. The sound of the arch motorcycle broke through the heavy stillness, its rumble echoing across the sand. Harrison raised a hand in silent acknowledgement as Keanu pulled away, dust trailing behind him like smoke. The first few miles were brutal. The road was cracked and uneven, shimmering under the glare of the sun. Every second felt slower than the last. The heat distorted the horizon, making the world look like a painting melting in real time. He kept his eyes locked on the road, pushing the throttle, feeling the engine hum through his entire body. 20 miles to go. That's what he told himself. Just 20 miles between life and death. The wind whipped against his jacket, carrying the scent of burning fuel from behind. His mind was racing faster than the wheels beneath him. He pictured the woman's trembling voice, the man's still hand, Harrison's determined eyes. They were counting on him now, and failure wasn't an option. He checked his phone again at the 10-mile mark. Nothing. No bars. He tightened his grip and leaned into the wind. The desert blurred past flat plains, scattered rocks, endless emptiness. Behind him, miles away, Harrison kept the fire in check from a distance, using sand to smother what he could. The two victims lay still, their lives suspended in fragile balance. The desert sun was beginning to dip lower, painting the sky in pale orange streaks. Keanu's eyes focused ahead. The road began to climb slightly, a ridge where the land rose above the plain. That's where the signal might be. He pushed harder, the engine roaring as he climbed the hill. He didn't feel the exhaustion, only the urgency. Every heartbeat was a countdown. Somewhere behind him, a man and woman were fighting for life. Somewhere ahead, a single signal bar could save them. He whispered into the wind, "Hold on, I'm coming." The desert stretched endlessly before him, a sea of cracked earth and molten light. Keanu's motorcycle roared down the highway, the sound echoing through the canyons like rolling thunder. Heat waves danced on the asphalt, bending the horizon into a mirage that seemed to pull farther away with every mile. His hands gripped the handlebars tight, the vibration humming through his bones. The sun was brutal. The air felt alive with fire. Every breath he took seared his throat. Sweat trickled down his temples, soaking the collar of his shirt beneath his jacket. But he didn't slow down. He couldn't. Somewhere behind him, Harrison was kneeling beside two strangers, fighting to stay alive. The clock was ticking, and every second mattered. His gas tank was half full. The road was uneven, scattered with patches of sand that made the tires slide if he wasn't careful. But Keanu didn't think about danger. He only thought about distance. He glanced at his phone mounted to the side of the handlebars. The screen glowed uselessly, no bars, no signal, no connection to the world that could help. He cursed under his breath and tucked it back into his jacket. The wind tore at his face as he picked up speed. The arch motorcycle responded to every movement of his body like an extension of his will. He leaned forward, the engine growling beneath him. The faster he went, the more his mind sharpened. But behind that focus was fear, a deep, gnawing fear that he pushed down with every mile. He thought about the woman's voice, barely a whisper. He thought about the man's limp body, Harrison's steady hands trying to keep them both alive. What if the fire spread? What if the man's breathing stopped? What if he was too late? The questions came in waves, but he refused to let them slow him down. He scanned the horizon again, empty desert, endless sky. The occasional tumbleweed drifted across the road, its shadow stretching long in the heat. A single hawk circled above, silent witness to the desperation below. At mile 10, his eyes burned from the glare. He blinked hard and focused again on the road. The sound of the engine was his only anchor, keeping him locked in the moment. He had been through dangerous rides before, mountain passes, rain-soaked highways, but nothing like this. This wasn't about thrill or freedom. It was about saving lives. He pressed on, the speedometer needle climbing past 80. The air was so dry it felt like it could crack his skin. He tried his phone again, just in case. Nothing. No bars, no flicker, no hope yet. The world around him was stripped bare of distraction. It was just him, the road, and the unbearable silence between engine roars. And still he rode harder, faster, praying silently that somewhere ahead a signal would appear. The road narrowed into a cracked ribbon of asphalt, shimmering beneath the violent heat. Every gust of wind carried sand that scraped across Keanu's face and arms, cutting like tiny blades. He leaned forward, his body low against the tank, feeling the vibration of the arch motorcycle pulse through him like a heartbeat. The speedometer read 90, but it felt slower, like time itself was fighting him. He tried the phone again. Nothing. Not a single bar. He pressed it against his chest, hoping some small flicker of signal might reach the metal case. Still, nothing. He clenched his jaw and shoved it back into his jacket, keeping one hand tight on the throttle. The engine roared louder, as if it could sense his urgency. The desert seemed alive, each mile whispering doubt. What if the couple didn't make it? What if Harrison couldn't hold out against the heat? The images came unbidden, the woman's pale face, the man's broken arm, the smoke curling higher into the sky. He blinked hard, forcing them away. There was no room for fear now. The road curved slightly, leading into a long valley between jagged ridges of red stone. Shadows pooled in the cracks, sharp and dark against the sunlight. Keanu's breath came in shallow bursts as he sped through. He caught a glimpse of himself reflected in the chrome of the handlebar, a face streaked with dust, eyes burning with determination. This was no movie scene. There were no second takes. When he hit the 15th mile, he began to doubt if he'd make it before the gas ran low. He tapped the tank with his glove, checking the weight by feel. Still enough. Barely. The road sloped upward, winding toward a ridge that overlooked the endless plain. He knew that was his best chance. Higher ground might mean a signal. He pushed harder, the engine growling as he climbed. At mile 17, something changed. His pocket buzzed faintly. He almost didn't believe it at first. He slowed down, coasting to the side of the road, heart pounding in his ears. He pulled out the phone. One bar, just one, blinking weakly in the corner of the screen. He killed the engine and dismounted, stumbling slightly as his legs adjusted from the ride. The air was eerily still. He climbed onto a flat rock near the roadside, holding the phone high. The signal flickered again, then steadied. He didn't hesitate. He dialed 911. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the faint click of connection. 911, what's your emergency? The voice came through, distant but clear enough. Keanu took a steadying breath. This is Keanu Reeves. We're off Highway 6 near Tonopah, Nevada. 2 accident victims, SUV overturned, 1 unconscious male, 1 injured female, possible fractures and internal bleeding. Vehicle caught fire. We need immediate medical evacuation. His tone was level but urgent, each word precise. The dispatcher's voice sharpened immediately. Copy that, sir. Can you confirm your location? Keanu turned in a slow circle, scanning the horizon. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, miles of barren earth and distant ridges that all looked the same. He swallowed hard, then spotted a sun-bleached mile marker half buried in the sand. Highway 6, near mile marker 218, he said. About 20 miles east of the Tonopah Junction. You'll see smoke from a vehicle fire. That's them. The dispatcher's tone softened, professional but empathetic. Rescue teams are being dispatched from Tonopah Fire and Nye County EMS. Estimated arrival, 60 to 70 minutes. Stay on the line if you can. Keanu shook his head slightly, staring at the fading bar of signal. I can't. I'm riding back. They're not alone out here. Do not risk re-entering the fire zone, but keep the victims stable if you can. We have your coordinates. Help is coming." "Thank you," Keanu said, his voice low but sincere. He ended the call before the signal could drop, staring at the lifeless phone screen for a moment before tucking it away. The sound of his own breathing filled the silence. 60 minutes. He didn't have 60 minutes. He swung back onto his motorcycle, turned the key, and the engine roared to life once again. Dust exploded behind him as he took off, tires biting into the rough asphalt. The wind hit his face like a wall, but he didn't slow down. Every part of him burned with urgency. He retraced the road, following the shimmering heat lines that blurred the horizon. The desert stretched wider now, more hostile. But he knew where to go, every curve and ridge imprinted in his mind from the ride before. The sun had begun to shift westward, tinting the sand in shades of amber and rust. At mile 5, he caught a glimpse of smoke in the far distance. Thin, gray, curling skyward, like a fragile signal. His heart kicked faster. Harrison was still there. The victims were still there. He pushed the throttle harder, the bike thundering over cracks and dips, gravel spitting out from under the wheels. As he rode, he thought of how surreal it was. A life built on acting out heroism, now confronted with the real thing. There were no scripts here, no cameras, just the raw reality of human life and the simple, unspoken duty to protect it. The closer he got, the thicker the smoke became. The smell of burnt metal hit him before the scene even came into view. His throat tightened, but he kept going. When he crested the final ridge, he saw the glint of Harrison's bike, parked near a cluster of rocks. Beyond it, the smoldering skeleton of the SUV, and 2 motionless figures lying in the sand. He slowed, pulling up beside them. Harrison looked up, his face streaked with soot but his eyes steady. "Did you get through?" Keanu nodded. "Help's on the way. About an hour out." Harrison gave a faint nod, relief passing over his face. "Then we hold the line." Keanu knelt beside the couple, checking pulses again, tightening the bandages. The heat pressed down, harder now, but they both ignored it. The worst had passed, but the fight wasn't over yet. The desert was quiet again, except for the faint hiss of the fire dying down. The blackened skeleton of the SUV still smoldered a few hundred feet away, heat radiating from twisted metal and charred rubber. Harrison Ford stood near the injured couple, his hand shading his eyes as he watched the last curl of smoke rise into the sky. The sun had shifted low, painting the sand in long gold streaks that glowed against the horizon. He crouched beside the woman first. Her breathing was shallow, but the bleeding from her leg had slowed under the pressure of Keanu's makeshift bandage. Harrison gently placed 2 fingers against her wrist, feeling the faint thump of her pulse. It was weak, but steady enough to give him hope. He moved next to the man, whose chest rose unevenly, but still, with life. The splint around his arm held firm. Harrison pressed 2 fingers against his neck. The beat was slower than before, but present. "You're gonna make it," he murmured under his breath. "Help's coming." His voice cracked slightly, not from doubt, but from the dryness of the desert air. His throat felt raw, his lips cracked from hours under the sun. He swallowed hard, trying to stay composed. He'd seen enough in his lifetime to know that fear could spread faster than fire if you let it. He reached for his saddlebag and pulled out an emergency blanket, a thin, reflective sheet of silver foil that crinkled like paper. He draped it over the couple to protect them from the harsh rays. Then he gathered small bits of brushwood from the roadside, stacking them loosely beside a flat rock where he planned to build a little shade cover. His movements were deliberate, his hands steady despite the exhaustion pressing down on him. Every once in a while, he glanced toward the horizon, half expecting to see Keanu's figure reappear at any moment. But the road stayed empty. The silence, unbroken. The heat shimmered, making the distance look like water. He pushed the thought of isolation away. Worry wouldn't help these two strangers. Action would. As he worked, a strange calm began to settle over him. It wasn't peace exactly, but something familiar like muscle memory. Decades ago, during the filming of an adventure movie, a small helicopter had gone down during a shoot in Hawaii. Harrison had been one of the first to reach the wreck. He remembered pulling a young cameraman from the wreckage, his arms covered in soot and oil. He hadn't thought then, just acted, and he was doing the same now. He found himself whispering to the unconscious man, "Don't give up on me. You hear? You've got someone waiting for you. We'll get you through this." He looked at the woman, her fingers twitching weakly against the sand. "You too. Stay with him." He adjusted the blanket again, then sank down onto his knees beside them, the fatigue beginning to show in the slump of his shoulders. The desert stretched on, silent witness to his vigil. The minutes crawled. Each one felt longer than the last. The air had lost its burning heat, but the stillness was heavy. The wind had died completely, leaving only the faint crackle of cooling metal in the distance. Harrison wiped his forehead with the back of his arm, smearing dust and sweat across his skin. His breathing was steady, controlled, but beneath that calm was a deep, pulsing ache in his chest, the weight of responsibility pressing down harder with every moment of silence. He walked over to the woman again, crouching low to check her pulse. Still there. He brushed a strand of hair from her face and felt the heat radiating off her skin. She needed hydration, but the small canteen he carried was almost empty. He poured the last few drops into the cap and let them fall slowly over her lips. She stirred faintly, her voice no louder than a whisper. "Where's my husband?" "Right here," Harrison said softly, pointing beside her. "He's alive. You just keep resting." Her hand shifted weakly toward the sound of his voice, until her fingers touched his. He held her hand gently, his thumb brushing the back of it in a reassuring rhythm. "Help's on the way," he said, repeating it like a promise. "Just hold on a little longer." When he looked back at the man, a wave of memory hit him, the young crew member he'd carried years ago. The weight of that moment, the smell of fuel and smoke, the fear in the man's eyes before he passed out. He remembered staying by his side, speaking to him just like this, refusing to believe it could end any other way. The man had survived that day. That memory gave Harrison strength now. He gathered a few larger pieces of brushwood, wedging them into the sand to create a fragile frame. From his saddlebag, he pulled out another thermal blanket and tied it between the branches, forming a small canopy. It wasn't much, but it broke the sun's direct glare. He then sat beside the couple, his back against one of the bikes, eyes scanning the horizon. The desert was painted in shades of gold and crimson now, the day nearing its end. The silence pressed in again. But it wasn't empty. It carried every beat of their breathing, every whisper of wind that brushed against their skin. Harrison checked his watch. Keanu had been gone nearly 40 minutes. He pictured him riding hard through the open road, dust trailing behind him, the bike cutting through the heat like a blade through glass. He trusted him completely. He spoke aloud, more to himself than to anyone else. "He'll make it. That guy's got heart." He looked down at the couple again. "And you'll make it too. You've got people who need you." He pressed his palm against the sand. It was cooling now, the temperature dropping with the fading light. He knew the cold would come fast once the sun disappeared. He had to prepare before that happened. As dusk deepened, the desert transformed. The blinding gold faded into bruised purples and soft grays, the kind of twilight that made the world feel ancient and still. Harrison could see his breath beginning to cloud faintly in the cooling air. The temperature was falling fast, just as he'd expected. He rose slowly, his back aching from hours of crouching and lifting, and moved toward his motorcycle to dig through the saddlebags again. He found an old fleece blanket, a roll of bandage, and a half-eaten protein bar from the morning. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He broke the bar in half, chewing a piece slowly as he watched the couple. The woman's breathing had steadied, shallow but rhythmic. The man was still unconscious, but the rise and fall of his chest kept Harrison grounded. That fragile sign of life was all he needed to keep going. He walked back and tucked the fleece over both of them. The last rays of sun brushed against their faces, glinting in the silver folds of the emergency blanket. Length of rope tied to the motorcycle's handlebar. Every small detail mattered anything to keep them warm and safe until help arrived. Then came the waiting. The long, unbearable quiet. He sat beside them again, the sand cold beneath him now, his elbows resting on his knees. The stars began to appear, one by one, sharp and bright against the endless black. He looked up at them for a moment, feeling the immensity of it all. He'd flown across deserts like this countless times in his own plane, guided by those same constellations. But tonight, they looked different. Closer somehow, like silent witnesses to the test before him. He checked the woman's pulse again, then the man's, both steady, though faint. He whispered softly, his voice almost breaking the still air. "You're doing good, both of you. Just stay with me a little longer." A sudden noise made him look up the distant hum of an engine. He held his breath and turned his head toward the open road. At first, he thought it might be the wind tricking his ears. Then it grew louder, steadier. His heart lifted. He knew that sound. Keanu's bike. When the headlights appeared on the horizon, bouncing faintly across the dunes, Harrison exhaled for the first time in what felt like an hour. He stood, raising one arm high. The light flickered, swayed, and came closer. Dust followed behind it, curling into the fading twilight. Keanu slowed as he approached, the engine's roar fading to a low hum. He parked beside Harrison, his face streaked with dust and exhaustion. Their eyes met, and in that look was everything relief, respect, and the unspoken understanding of two men who had done what had to be done. "Help's coming," Keanu said, his voice hoarse. Harrison nodded, the faintest smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Then we keep them alive until it gets here." The desert night had fallen completely, but between the two of them, there was a quiet light, the kind that doesn't fade. By the time the sun slipped behind the western ridge, the desert had already begun to change. The golden light that once scorched their skin now faded into a pale blue, stretching long shadows across the sand. The temperature dropped fast, so fast it made Keanu's breath visible when he exhaled. The heat of the day had vanished, replaced by a chill that seeped through every layer of clothing. He glanced toward the smoldering wreck in the distance. Now, little more than a blackened husk against the horizon. The last flickers of fire had died, leaving behind thin trails of smoke curling lazily into the dusk. He turned back toward Harrison, who was crouched near the two victims. They were wrapped tightly in jackets and blankets, lying close to one another for warmth. Their bodies looked small against the vastness of the desert. The woman stirred again, her eyes fluttering open. Her voice came out faint, cracked by dehydration and pain. Where are we?" Keanu knelt beside her, unscrewing the cap of his flask. "You're safe," he said gently. "We're right here with you." He tipped the bottle carefully, letting a few drops of water touch her lips. She swallowed weakly, blinking at him through the dim light. "My husband," she whispered. "He's alive," Keanu said, his tone calm and certain. "He's right next to you. Don't try to move." The woman's name, they later learned, was Clara. The man beside her, her husband, was Luke. He had drifted in and out of consciousness all evening, sometimes groaning softly, sometimes lying utterly still. Harrison sat beside him now, one hand pressed lightly against his chest, counting breaths. Every few minutes he'd lean close and murmur something steady and grounding. You're gonna be fine, buddy. Just stay with me. When the first wind picked up, a sharp gust that sent sand whispering across the ground, Keanu stood and began collecting brushwood. The dry sage cracked easily in his hands. He remembered a pile of driftwood they'd passed earlier that day near an abandoned set prop, a fake wagon frame left behind from filming. He walked quickly, the wind tugging at his jacket, and gathered what he could carry. By the time he returned, twilight had deepened into indigo. Harrison had cleared a small patch of sand and stacked a few stones to block the wind. Together, they built a small campfire. The first flame struggled against the cold air, then caught, flickering orange and gold. The warmth spread slowly, the firelight reflecting on their faces, on the foil of the emergency blanket, and on the pale, fragile faces of the two survivors. Keanu sat beside the fire for a moment, holding his hands near the heat. His muscles ached. His throat felt raw from dust. But the sight of the flames gave him something he hadn't felt all day: control. "We'll keep them warm," he said quietly. Harrison nodded, his eyes reflecting the flicker of light. "Yeah, as long as we have to." The campfire burned low, its glow stretching across the sand like a living heartbeat. The night had fully settled in, wrapping the desert in silence and cold. Above them, the stars blazed sharp and endless, scattered like salt across the black sky. Harrison tossed another piece of driftwood onto the flames and rubbed his hands together, trying to chase the chill from his fingers. Clara stirred again, her breathing shallow but steady. Keanu leaned close, making sure she stayed awake. Her eyelids fluttered as she whispered, How long have we been here?" "Just a few hours," Keanu said gently. "Help is coming. They're on their way." She nodded weakly, her gaze drifting toward the firelight. "It's so cold," she murmured. Keanu took off his leather gloves and tucked them beneath her head as a cushion. Then he wrapped another layer of his jacket around her shoulders. "You'll be warm soon," he said softly. His voice had a rhythm to it, like a steady pulse that carried reassurance even in the dark. Harrison sat nearby, checking Luke's breathing for what felt like the 100th time. The man's chest rose and fell in slow, uneven waves. Every now and then, Harrison pressed 2 fingers to his neck, counting silently. He'd learned to listen to breath, to measure the strength of life not in sound, but in stillness. "His pulse is holding," Harrison said quietly. "He's tough." Keanu nodded, his eyes fixed on the fire. "Yeah, they both are." For a few moments, neither spoke. The wind rustled across the desert floor, carrying a faint whistling sound through the sagebrush. The fire popped softly, a spark jumping into the air before fading. Then, Harrison broke the silence. "You ever think about how many moments like this go unnoticed?" Keanu glanced at him. "What do you mean?" "Out here," Harrison said, his voice low, reflective. "There's no camera, no press, no script. Just people trying to do what's right when nobody's watching. That's what tells you who you are." Keanu stared into the fire, watching it shift and dance. "You don't need cameras to tell the truth of a man," he said. "You just need choices. The small ones. The ones nobody talks about." Harrison looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Yeah, choices and time." He leaned forward, poking the fire with a stick, sending a swirl of sparks into the air. "That's what makes a person worth remembering." Keanu's face softened in the glow. "Maybe that's all legacy really is. Not fame, not headlines, just what you do when it matters." The 2 men sat there quietly after that, each lost in thought, listening to the crackle of the fire and the faint sound of Clara's breathing behind them. The night felt endless, but not empty. It held something sacred. 2 men who had lived through decades of noise, now finding meaning in silence. The hours dragged on, measured only by the slow collapse of the fire and the rhythmic breathing of the 2 victims. The desert cold had deepened, biting at every inch of exposed skin. Keanu stood and paced in small circles to stay warm, his boots crunching against the sand. Every few minutes, he checked his phone again. Still no signal, just darkness and wind. Harrison remained by Luke's side, occasionally adjusting the splint or tightening the jacket around his chest. He spoke softly, more to keep the man connected to life than to himself. "You're doing good," he murmured. "Stay with us. Don't give up now." His voice was low, steady, carrying the kind of calm born from experience and anchor against the weight of uncertainty. Clara's breathing had grown quieter, but her pulse still fluttered beneath Keanu's fingers. He poured a few drops of water onto her lips again. She blinked slowly, eyes glassy but alive. "My son," she whispered faintly. "We were driving to see him." Keanu's throat tightened. "You will," he said softly. "You'll see him again. Just keep fighting." He tucked the blanket closer around her shoulders and moved back toward the fire. Harrison looked up at him, his face half lit by the flames. "She talk?" "A little," Keanu replied. "They were going to see their son, probably waiting for them somewhere tonight." Harrison exhaled heavily through his nose, glancing at the dark horizon. "Then we make sure they get there." The fire popped again, throwing a shower of sparks that glowed for a moment before vanishing into the night. Keanu crouched and stirred the embers, feeding in the last bits of dry wood. The orange light flickered across their faces, illuminating exhaustion and grit. It wasn't heroic, it was human. Two men doing what they could in the middle of nowhere, because doing nothing wasn't an option. As the wind shifted, a low, mournful sound rolled through the dunes. The wind events. Air carried the faint howl of coyotes somewhere in the distance. It reminded them how small they were out here, how vast the desert truly was. Harrison leaned back against his bike, closing his eyes for a moment. "You ever think the quiet can tell you more than the noise?" Keanu glanced at him. "Every day." The older man smiled faintly. "I used to chase the next role, the next headline. Now I think the best parts of life happen when no one's looking." Keanu's gaze drifted back to Clara and Luke. "Then this might be one of those parts," he said quietly. The fire burned lower, turning from flame to glowing coal. The stars above were blindingly bright now, scattered across a sky that felt infinite. Both men sat in silence, their breath clouding in the cold air. Somewhere in the distance, faintly and far off, a sound echoed a low hum that didn't belong to the wind. Harrison opened his eyes, listening. "You hear that?" Keanu turned his head, straining to catch it. A faint engine. A promise. He looked toward the horizon, where a small glimmer of light trembled in the darkness. His heart lifted. "Rescue's coming," he said, quietly. Harrison smiled, weary but certain. "Told you we'd keep them alive." The desert, once hostile and silent, seemed to exhale with them, holding its breath no longer. The desert night had a strange kind of silence alive, but fragile. Coyotes cried somewhere beyond the ridges, their haunting voices echoing through the open canyons. Each call faded, replaced by another from farther away, like the land itself was breathing in rhythm. Above them, the sky was vast and endless, littered with stars so bright they looked close enough to touch. Without the noise of civilization, the universe revealed itself in full, infinite, and humbling. The campfire was the only light for miles. Its glow flickered against the sand, throwing long shadows over the faces of the four souls gathered around it. Keanu sat cross-legged beside the flames, slowly feeding small pieces of wood into the fire. His movements were steady and measured, as if the rhythm itself was keeping him grounded. The orange light danced across his face, glinting off the dust in his hair and the faint exhaustion behind his eyes. Across from him, Harrison sat on a flat rock, sharpening the edge of a small piece of wood with a pocket knife. He wasn't trying to pass the time. He was keeping his hands busy, his mind focused. The wood was from the same brush Keanu had gathered earlier, and in the dim light, Harrison's rough hands shaped it with quiet purpose. The victims lay close to the fire. Clara's head rested gently against a rolled-up jacket, her face pale but peaceful. Luke was beside her, his chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. Every now and then, Harrison would glance their way, just to be sure. Every now and then, Keanu would reach out and adjust the blanket to keep them warm. Clara stirred, her lips moving faintly. "Luke," she whispered, voice dry and weak. Keanu leaned in close, his voice soft. "He's right here," he said, pointing toward the still form beside her. "He's breathing. He's okay." Her eyes fluttered open, glassy with tears. "You saved us," she whispered. Keanu shook his head slightly. "Not yet," he said, "but we're not leaving you." She tried to smile, but her strength was gone. Her hand moved weakly toward her husband's, her fingers trembling in the effort to reach him. Keanu gently guided their hands together. When her skin brushed his, she sighed a sound halfway between relief and exhaustion and drifted back into uneasy sleep. The night deepened further. The cold grew sharper, creeping in from the edges of the dunes. Keanu drew his knees up and wrapped his arms around them for warmth. He looked across the fire at Harrison, who was still carving the small piece of wood. "What are you making?" Keanu asked. Harrison didn't look up. "Something to mark this place," he said quietly, "just in case." Keanu's gaze lingered on him for a moment. The fire popped, sending a spark into the air that drifted upward before vanishing into the starlight. "We're not going to need a marker," Keanu said. "We'll need something for after." Harrison paused, the knife still in his hand. He looked up at Keanu through the haze of smoke and shadow, the lines in his face deepened by the firelight. "After?" he asked quietly. Keanu gave a faint smile. "When they're safe. When this night's behind us. Maybe that piece of wood turns into something better than a grave marker. Maybe it's a reminder that we did the right thing." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind brushed past them, carrying a low hum that sounded almost like distant music. Harrison set the knife down on his knee and looked toward the sleeping couple. His eyes softened. "You ever wonder," he said, after a long silence, "why things happen like this? Two strangers in trouble, two actors just passing through. Out of everyone on Earth, it's us who find them." Keanu poked the fire gently, watching the embers flare. "Maybe it's not about why," he said. "Maybe it's about what you do when it happens. The world throws things in your path for a reason. You just don't see it until later." Harrison leaned back slightly, thinking that over. The stars above them looked impossibly bright, their light shimmering across the dunes. "You always been like that?" he asked finally. "Seeing meaning in everything?" Keanu's expression was quiet, thoughtful. "I don't know. I've seen a lot of loss. Makes you start looking for reasons to keep going. Sometimes that reason is just doing something good when you can." Harrison nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. "I get that." He reached for the piece of wood again and began carving more carefully now, his hands moving with deliberate precision. "Guess we're both stubborn like that," he said, half smiling. "Never could stand the idea of just watching something fall apart." Keanu chuckled softly. "You? No. You're the guy who still flies his own helicopter into storms." Harrison gave a small laugh, shaking his head. "Don't remind me. My wife hates that. Says one day I'll run out of luck." He paused, his voice lowering. "But I figure if you can help someone when it counts, that's luck worth having." The fire cracked, sending a spray of sparks into the air. They both watched them drift upward and vanish into the night. Clara murmured in her sleep, her hand tightening around her husband's. Harrison's eyes softened again. "She's fighting," he said. Keanu looked at her, the firelight flickering across his face. "They both are, and they're gonna make it." For a long while they sat in silence again, The desert stretched endlessly around them. The stars reflected faintly on the sand, as if the sky had doubled itself. The sound of the wind was steady now, almost soothing. Harrison resumed carving, slow and patient. Keanu stared into the fire, his face calm, his thoughts somewhere beyond the flames. The night was cold, but in that stillness, there was warmth. The kind of warmth that comes only from knowing you're exactly where you're meant to be. Hours passed in that deep desert stillness. The moon climbed high, silvering the sand and softening every edge of the world. The campfire burned to a low, glowing ember, its light pulsing faintly against the dark. Keanu added the last piece of wood, watching it catch and flare with a quiet satisfaction. The flame's reflection danced in his eyes, mingling with exhaustion and resolve. Harrison's carving was finished, now a small, smooth cross with clean edges shaped from the desert wood. He turned it in his hand, studying it for a long moment. When Keanu glanced over, Harrison gave a faint, tired grin. "Guess you were right," he said. "This doesn't belong to loss. It belongs to gratitude." Keanu smiled back, nodding slowly. "Then, it's a thank you gift," he said, "for the people who taught us how to stay human." They placed the small cross beside the fire, not as a marker of death, but as a quiet symbol of faith. Faith that help was coming, that the night would end, that goodness still mattered in a world that often forgot. Luke groaned faintly in his sleep, his voice low but alive. Clara shifted closer to him, her fingers brushing his sleeve. The movement was small, but to Keanu and Harrison, it felt like victory. Harrison whispered, "That's it. Keep holding on." Keanu looked up at the sky. Again. "You ever notice," he said quietly, "how moments like this remind you what life's really about?" Harrison followed his gaze to the stars. "Yeah," he said. "All the noise fades, and what's left is the truth." The firelight flickered between them. Two men no longer separated by fame or years, but joined by something simpler: duty, decency, and shared silence. The desert felt infinite, but in that small circle of warmth, there was peace. Neither of them spoke again for a long time. The only sounds were the wind whispering through the sagebrush, the slow rhythm of breathing, and the crackle of the last embers. By the time dawn began to tint the eastern sky, both men were still awake, sitting shoulder to shoulder beside the fading fire. Two legends, not acting, not pretending, just keeping watch over life itself. The horizon was still dark when the first hint of dawn appeared, a faint silver line stretching across the east. The air had turned cold enough to sting their hands, and every breath came out in small clouds. Keanu sat close to the dying fire, eyes fixed on the horizon. Harrison dozed lightly beside the couple, his head tilted forward, his jacket pulled tight around his shoulders. The night had been long, but they had kept the promise to keep them alive until help arrived. Then, faintly, from somewhere far beyond the dunes, came a low hum. Keanu lifted his head. It wasn't the wind this time. It was something mechanical, rhythmic engines. He stood slowly, scanning the dark stretch of desert. In the distance, a faint light flickered, moving steadily closer. He blinked. Once, twice, making sure it wasn't a mirage. Then another light appeared beside it, and another. "Harrison," he said, his voice breaking the silence. The older man stirred instantly, alert despite his fatigue. "What is it?" "Engines," Keanu said. "I think they found us." They both stood. The lights grew brighter, bouncing slightly with the rhythm of uneven terrain. The low hum became a recognizable rumble. Keanu grabbed his flashlight, its weak beam cutting through the pale dawn. He began waving it in wide arcs, signaling across the emptiness. The reflection flashed against his jacket and the sand. Harrison knelt beside Clara and Luke, speaking softly. "You hear that? Help's coming. Just hang on." Clara stirred, her lips trembling. "Thank God," she whispered. Luke didn't respond, but his breathing continued, faint but steady. Within minutes, the first vehicle appeared clearly, a large ambulance. Headlights blazing, tires kicking up sand as it bounced across the rugged ground. Behind it came a sheriff's SUV, its red and blue lights pulsing faintly against the dim sky. The sound filled the desert, sharp and powerful after hours of silence. Keanu felt relief wash over him like a tide. He lowered his arm as the vehicle stopped, their doors flying open. Paramedics jumped out, carrying medical kits, stretchers, and oxygen tanks. Their voices were quick, organized, focused. 2 victims, Harrison said, pointing, both conscious at times, but fading in and out. She's got a leg wound, possible internal bleeding. He's got a broken arm, maybe a fracture in the leg. One of the paramedics nodded, kneeling beside Clara. Another went straight to Luke, checking his vitals with practiced efficiency. "Pulse weak but present," one said. "Let's stabilize the leg and get fluid started." As they worked, one of the medics looked up at Keanu, recognition flickering in his eyes. He froze for a second, the surprise plain on his face. Keanu cut him off gently. "They need help first," he said. His voice was calm, almost kind, but firm enough to close the topic. The medic nodded quickly and returned to his work. Keanu stepped back beside Harrison, both men watching silently as the professionals took over. Their bodies ached, their clothes were streaked with soot and dust, but their minds were finally easing for the first time in hours. The paramedics worked with a precision that felt almost unreal after the chaos of the night. Harrison crouched nearby, handing them whatever they asked for: extra gauze, a flashlight, his own scarf to support an IV line. The smell of antiseptic and diesel filled the cold morning air as the ambulance's back doors swung open. Clara winced as they lifted her onto a stretcher, her eyes darting around in confusion. Keanu knelt beside her for a moment, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he said softly. "They've got you." Her eyes filled with tears, her lips forming silent words of gratitude she was too weak to speak. The paramedic gave a short nod to Keanu before closing the stretcher straps. "We'll take good care of her," he said. Luke was next. 2 rescuers lifted him gently, supporting his arm and leg as they slid him onto the second stretcher. Harrison stayed close, helping to guide the straps around his shoulders. The man groaned softly, but didn't wake. The sheriff approached as the paramedics secured the stretchers inside. He was a tall, broad man in his 50s, with dust on his boots and a weary kindness in his expression. He looked from the wreck to the 2 actors, studying them for a moment before speaking. "You the ones who called it in?" Keanu nodded. "Yeah. We found them last night off the highway." The sheriff glanced toward the blackened wreckage in the distance, then back at them. "That was a hell of a thing you did. You both saved their lives." Keanu shook his head. "Just did what anyone should do." Harrison gave a half smile, his voice quiet but sincere. "Maybe not anyone," he said. The sheriff gave a small, knowing nod, his breath fogging in the morning air. "Still," he said, "the world could use a few more men like you." They didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The sound of the ambulance doors closing broke the stillness. The engine started, humming low and steady. The siren stayed off. There was no need to disturb the quiet. As the vehicles pulled away, the flashing lights faded into the distance until they were just faint glimmers on the horizon. The desert, once again, returned to silence. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying the faint scent of burnt metal. Keanu and Harrison stood side by side, watching until the lights disappeared completely. Their faces were tired, but there was peace in their eyes, a wordless understanding of what they had just shared. Finally, Harrison spoke. He said, glancing toward Keanu, "This might be the first time I've been part of a rescue where nobody yelled, 'Cut!'" Keanu chuckled softly, his voice low and rough. "Yeah," he said. and probably the only one that really mattered. They both smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from quiet pride and relief. The sun was rising now, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold. Two men, covered in dust, stood at the edge of the desert, not as movie stars, but as proof that decency still had a place in the world. When the sun was fully up, the world looked almost new again. The night's chill had lifted, and the desert that had been their prison now shimmered in soft gold light. The ambulance tracks were still fresh in the sand, stretching toward the highway like lines drawn by fate. Harrison stood beside his motorcycle, tightening the straps on his saddlebag, while Keanu poured the last of his water over the fire pit until the smoke turned to steam. Neither man spoke much. They didn't need to. The stillness said everything. When they finally rode back toward the film set, the world seemed to move slower. The road felt longer than it had the day before. The same cracked asphalt, the same ridges of stone, but now each mile carried a strange gravity, like the land itself remembered what had happened. By the time they arrived, the sun was high, and the camp buzzed with activity. Crew members scurried between trailers. Cameras gleamed in the light, and the director's voice carried over the hum of generators. Then someone spotted them. "They're back!" a voice called. Keanu and Harrison rolled to a stop near the main tent, engines idling before falling silent. Dust clung to their clothes, and the fatigue in their eyes told the story without words. A few people rushed over, questions already forming. "Where were you guys all night?" one of the assistants asked. "We were about to send a search party." Harrison glanced at Keanu, who only gave a faint, tired smile. "Had to make a detour," Keanu said quietly. It didn't take long for the news to surface. The sheriff's office had already called the studio to verify their identities as witnesses in an emergency rescue. Within an hour, the story was everywhere. A young production assistant, too excited to keep quiet, shared what she'd heard from the sheriff with a local reporter. By midday, the headline appeared on a small Nevada news site: "Keanu Reeves and Harrison Ford rescue couple in desert crash." The article described everything: the overturned SUV, the handmade bandages, the long cold night under the stars. It painted a picture of two men who didn't hesitate, who didn't care about attention, who stayed because it was the right thing to do. The story spread quickly, from small local papers to national outlets. Reporters began arriving at the set, cameras in hand, eager to capture the heroes' reactions. But when they approached Keanu and Harrison, both refused to speak. Keanu was the first to respond. "We're here to finish a movie," he said simply, his tone calm and final. "The real story is that those two people are alive." The journalist pressed him, asking how it felt, what he'd been thinking, what it meant to him. But Keanu just smiled politely and walked away, heading toward the soundstage where the crew was preparing the next scene. Harrison followed his lead, removing his hat and muttering, "Not everything's for the cameras." The reporters lingered, disappointed but respectful. They would get their story, but not the spectacle. The crew continued their day as if nothing had changed, but everyone could feel that something had. The atmosphere on set was quieter, more reverent. People moved with a strange awareness, glancing now and then at the two actors who had spent the night in the desert. They didn't speak of it directly, but word spread in whispers about Keanu giving his jacket for a tourniquet, about Harrison using his own shirt to splint a broken arm, about the fire that had nearly taken 2 lives. Between takes, the makeup artist offered to cover the small cuts on Keanu's hands, but he shook his head. "Leave them," he said softly. "They're fine." He didn't want to erase the night. Some things weren't meant to be covered up. When lunch came around, Harrison sat beneath the shade of a truck, sipping water from a bottle. The set medic approached him to check for dehydration, but Harrison waved him off with a dry chuckle. "I've had worse days," he said. His eyes, though, carried a faraway look. Every time a helicopter passed in the distance, he paused, staring into the horizon as if replaying the memory of the night before. Later that afternoon, a representative from the sheriff's department arrived. The man thanked them both again, shaking their hands with quiet sincerity. "Those people are stable," he said. The doctor said another hour and they wouldn't have made it. Keanu just nodded, his voice almost a whisper. That's good to hear. The sheriff smiled faintly before adding, We told the press what you did. They'll probably run with it for days. You should be proud. Then answered, We're just glad they're alive. When the officer left, Harrison muttered under his breath, Pride's overrated anyway. Keanu grinned slightly. Yeah, it gets loud. By evening, the story had spread across national headlines. Studio executives tried to convince both men to give a statement, even suggesting a small press conference for publicity. Both refused. They didn't raise their voices or make demands. They just stayed quiet and kept working. That night, after filming wrapped, the production accountant received an anonymous request to pay 2 hospital bills in full. One for a man named Luke Spencer, the other for Clara Spencer. No fanfare, no signature, just a note attached for recovery from friends on the road. When the sheriff was later asked by a reporter to describe what he saw that morning, his answer was simple. They acted like normal people, not stars, he said. And that's what made them great. Back on set, the desert wind swept softly through the empty trailers as night fell again. Keanu sat alone by a campfire built for a scene the next day. He looked into the flames for a long while, then smiled faintly, as if hearing the echo of that quiet night, a reminder that sometimes the loudest moments of greatness are the ones no one ever performs. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady rhythm of machines and the faint hum of air conditioning. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, soft and golden, painting pale stripes across the sheets. Clara opened her eyes slowly, the blur of white walls and unfamiliar faces swimming into focus. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Her leg ached, her throat felt dry, and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic. Then she saw Luke in the next bed, his arm in a cast, a bandage across his temple, his eyes closed, but breathing steady. Relief washed over her like a tide. A nurse noticed her movement and hurried over with a kind smile. Good morning, Clara. You've been asleep for a while. You're safe now. You're in Las Vegas General Hospital. Vegas? She whispered, confused. How did we get here? The nurse adjusted her pillow, checking her vitals. A rescue team brought you in. You've been through a lot. You were lucky someone found you out there. Clara blinked, trying to remember. The last thing she recalled was the blinding light of the desert, the sound of wind, and a man's voice telling her she was safe. Who? She asked faintly. Who found us? The nurse hesitated, then smiled again. You'll want to see this. She reached for a folded newspaper, sitting on the tray by the bed, and handed it to her. The headline stretched across the front page in bold black letters. Keanu Reeves and Harrison Ford rescue desert crash victims. For a moment, Clara just stared, her mind blank. Then she gasped softly, pressing a trembling hand to her mouth. No, that can't be right, she whispered. But it was. There they were. 2 familiar faces beneath the headline, standing in dusty clothes beside an ambulance. The story detailed every moment. The crash, the fire, the makeshift bandages, the night spent under the sky. Stars. Tears filled her eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks. She turned toward Luke, who had begun to stir at the sound of her sobs. His eyes fluttered open, dazed and heavy. Clara? He said hoarsely. You okay? She nodded quickly, holding the newspaper toward him with shaking hands. Luke, it was them. Keanu Reeves, Harrison Ford. They saved us. He frowned, squinting at the headline. His mouth fell open slowly. You're kidding, he whispered. She shook her head, her voice breaking. They didn't just save us, they stayed with us all night. Luke sank back against the pillow, silent for a long moment. Then, with a shaky exhale, he said quietly, "They didn't have to, but they did." The nurse smiled softly as she replaced Clara's foreline. "Sometimes the world still surprises us," she said. "You two were very lucky." Clara reached for Luke's hand, gripping it tightly. For the first time since the crash, she felt something beyond. Fear, gratitude, that reached deep into her chest and refused to let go. 2 days later, both Clara and Luke were strong enough to sit up and speak to the doctors. Their bodies still ached, but the danger had passed. The nurses brought them warm meals, fresh linens, and kind words. Yet what they wanted most wasn't comfort, it was closure. They needed to thank the men who had saved them. Clara asked if the hospital had contact information for their rescuers. The nurse smiled gently. "They left their names with the sheriff's report, but didn't leave numbers. Said if you ever wanted to reach them, you could send a note through the station." So they did. That evening, Clara and Luke wrote letters in shaky handwriting. They thanked them for their courage, for staying, for choosing compassion over convenience. Luke wrote, "You didn't just save us, you reminded us what it means to be human." They sealed both notes together and sent them to the Tonopah Sheriff's Office, never expecting a reply. A few days passed before an envelope arrived. It bore no return address, only 2 sets of initials written in clean, simple handwriting. Inside were 2 separate notes, one from each man. Keanu's was brief, but heartfelt. "Dear Clara and Luke, we're just glad you're still here. Live well. That's all the thanks we need. K." Harrison's was slightly longer, written in his steady, rugged penmanship. "The world needs good stories, and yours didn't end in the desert. Take it from 2 guys who've seen a lot use the time you've been given. It's worth more than anything else." Clara cried as she read them aloud. Luke, holding her hand, smiled through tears. "They really meant it," he said softly. "No cameras, no spotlight, just people doing the right thing." After their recovery, they decided not to let the experience fade into memory. Clara, still walking with a cane, began volunteering at a local first aid center. She told the director she wanted to help others learn the skills that had once saved her life. Every week, she taught small classes on emergency response. How to make a tourniquet, how to stay calm under pressure, how to help strangers without hesitation. She never mentioned who had inspired her, but she kept the letter folded in her pocket wherever she went. Luke found his own way to honor what happened. When he could travel again, he began speaking at schools and community events about gratitude and quiet heroism. He told the story without the celebrity names, calling it "The Night in the Desert." His message was always the same. Sometimes help comes from the people you least expect, and sometimes the greatest heroes don't want to be known at all. Their lives, once ordinary, were forever changed. They learned that survival wasn't just about being pulled from wreckage. It was about what you did after, about how you lived with the gift you'd been given. On their first anniversary after the accident, they drove back through Nevada. Near the stretch of highway where their car had overturned, they stopped. The sand still bore faint tire marks, and a small wooden cross, weathered but standing, remained in the distance. Clara smiled softly. "They left it," she whispered. Luke nodded, the wind tugging at his jacket. "Not a grave," he said, "a reminder." And together, they stood in the quiet, facing the rising sun that had once nearly been their last. Now, the beginning of everything new. By the time Keanu and Harrison returned to Los Angeles, the rescue had already become something larger than a story. It was a quiet legend making its way through the hallways of Hollywood. No one knew the details firsthand, but everyone seemed to know something. A producer claimed he'd spoken to the sheriff himself. A cinematographer swore a crew member had seen the men ride out before sunset and return covered in dust. But the truth was simpler and far more profound than the rumors could ever capture. On set, Keanu went about his work as if nothing had happened. He still arrived early, still greeted the crew with his gentle, "Morning, brother," still stayed long after shooting to thank everyone individually. The only difference was the look in his eyes, something deeper, quieter. Those who worked closest to him said that when he looked at you now, it was as if he saw right through the surface, as if he understood something most people forgot. His hands, raw and blistered from the night in the desert, were hard to hide. The makeup team offered to cover the marks before each take, but he refused. "It's fine," he said simply. "They'll heal." The wounds did, but the story didn't fade. It lingered in conversations, in the glances between crew members, in the way people lowered their voices when his name came up. Harrison, on the other hand, was even more withdrawn than usual. The man who had once been quick with a joke or a sharp one-liner now carried a reflective stillness wherever he went. When reporters later asked him about the incident during an interview for a new film, he gave a small shrug and said only, "You don't talk about decency, you live it." That one line became famous overnight. It was quoted across entertainment blogs, carved into memes, repeated at award ceremonies as an example of old-school character in a world hungry for applause. But to those who knew him, that line wasn't meant to inspire anyone. It was just the truth. Harrison didn't see what he and Keanu had done as heroism. He saw it as something you were supposed to do when life gave you a chance to stand up. Nothing more. Around studio lots and backstages, the whispers grew. Younger actors repeated the story between takes, wide-eyed, trying to imagine two movie icons risking their lives in a barren desert to save strangers. A young stunt coordinator who had once doubled for Keanu on a motorcycle scene told his friends, "That's who he really is. The guy everyone thinks he plays? That's him off camera too." Others nodded, almost reverent. In an industry that often worshipped image over integrity, the story felt like something sacred. A reminder that decency still had a place in a business built on make-believe. The story moved quietly through the studios, like a ripple through calm water. It wasn't printed in tabloids or shouted across red carpets. Instead, it was shared in hushed tones, usually beginning with the same sentence. "Did you hear what Keanu and Harrison did in Nevada?" And though no one could agree on every detail, the essence of it stayed true. Two men who didn't wait for cameras, who didn't look for credit, who simply acted. In the weeks that followed, both men were asked about it more times than they could count. Keanu would only smile, shake his head, and redirect the question. "That night wasn't about us," he said once to a journalist who pressed him gently. "It was about helping people who needed it. That's all." His refusal to elaborate only made the story more powerful. There was something magnetic about his silence, a dignity that spoke louder than any headline could. Harrison remained the same. He finished his commitments on the Western film and declined every interview that mentioned the word hero. To his friends, he'd waved the subject away with a single line: "We just did what anyone with a pulse should do." Yet those same friends noticed that he had changed in small ways. He stayed longer on set to talk with young crew members. He asked the prop manager about his family. He seemed more present than before, as if the desert had stripped away the noise and reminded him what mattered. One evening, during a wrap party, a young actress approached him nervously, clutching a drink in her hand. "Mr. Ford," she said, "I read what you did. It made me think about how I treat people when the cameras aren't on." Harrison smiled faintly, taking a sip of his water before replying. "That's the only time it counts," he said. Then he tipped his hat and walked away. Within a few months, the rescue had become a kind of parable around the industry. Not a publicity stunt, not a myth of fame, but a moral compass for those trying to navigate an often shallow world. The stunt coordinator who had worked with Keanu the longest summed it up best during a team meeting. "They didn't save lives for headlines," he said, quietly. "They saved them because they still remember what being human means." That line was repeated countless times afterward. especially among younger actors who grew up idolizing both men. It wasn't the kind of lesson you learned in acting school, it was one you lived, one you felt deep in your chest when the lights were gone, and the only thing left was choice. The myth of that desert night would never fade. It became a whispered benchmark in an industry that too often confused popularity with purpose. People didn't just admire Keanu Reeves and Harrison Ford for their films anymore. They admired them for the reminder that greatness has nothing to do with applause. And that's how legends endure. Not through awards or fame, but through acts of quiet grace that ripple through the hearts of others long after the cameras stop rolling. The weeks that followed were quiet. The film wrapped. The interviews faded. The desert became just another place again, empty, vast, and silent under an endless sky. But for Keanu, something about it lingered. The stillness, the faces, the fragile breath of those two strangers he couldn't shake the memory. One morning before dawn, he packed a small leather bag, slipped on his jacket, and wheeled his motorcycle out of the garage. The air in Los Angeles was cool and heavy with fog, but he could already feel the call of the desert beyond the city lights. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He just rode. The highway was empty, stretching into miles of open road. The hum of the engine became its own kind of meditation. The world blurred into motion, billboards, gas stations, the faint glow of sunrise creeping up behind him. With every mile, the noise of fame, of work, of interviews and expectations began to fall away. What was left was just the road, the wind, and the echo of that night when everything had slowed to a single heartbeat. By midday, he reached the same stretch of desert highway where it had happened. The land looked different now. The scorched remains of the SUV were gone. The sand had shifted, smoothing everything over, as if nature itself had erased the evidence. No tire tracks, no burned rubber, no trace of the fire or the fear, just silence. Keanu stopped the bike and let the engine idle softly. He sat there for a while, helmet resting on his handlebars, eyes scanning the horizon. The wind tugged gently at his jacket. He could still see flashes in his mind. The smoke, the heat, the sound of Harrison's voice, the trembling breath of the woman as he whispered that she was safe. It felt both close and far away, like a scene from a dream he wasn't meant to wake from. He dismounted and walked slowly toward the side of the road. His boots crunched over gravel and sand. The air was clean here, dry, pure, untouched by noise. He knelt down, touching the ground where the wreck had once been. The sand was cool beneath his fingertips. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet. A small gust of wind passed, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush. It was peaceful, almost sacred. He thought about how fragile everything was, how thin the line between life and loss could be. One moment, you're driving under the open sky, thinking about nothing but the road ahead. The next, your entire world changes because someone else decided not to keep riding. He opened his eyes and looked at the horizon again. The desert stretched endlessly, golden under the afternoon sun. Keanu stood for a long time, watching the wind move across the sand. The desert had a rhythm of its own, a slow, quiet pulse that seemed to breathe with him. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The silence wasn't empty, it was alive. It was the same silence that had surrounded them that night, the same stillness that had reminded him how precious every heartbeat could be. He thought about how the world kept spinning after moments like that. The news cycle moved on. The world forgot. People went back to talking about box office numbers, about roles, about fame. But for him, it wasn't something to move past. It was something to carry. A reminder that behind all the noise, there were still small, pure acts that made life worth living. He picked up a flat piece of stone from the ground, roughly the size of his hand. Its surface was smooth from years of wind. He turned it over in his fingers, brushing away the dust. Then, pulling a small pocket tool from his bag, he began to carve. The sound of metal against stone was faint, almost lost to the breeze. He didn't carve much, just one word. Simple, quiet, and true. Alive. When he finished, he placed the stone by the roadside, right where the sand met the cracked asphalt. He pressed it into the earth, gently, leaving half of it exposed to the light. For a while, he just looked at it. That single word, resting against the endless desert. It wasn't a memorial. It wasn't about tragedy. It was about endurance, about breath, about the fragile miracle of still being here. He sat down beside it, resting his arms on his knees, and closed his eyes. For the first time in a long while, his mind was still. He thought about Clara and Luke, their voices, their faces, the gratitude in their letters. He wondered if they had kept their promises to live differently, to carry forward the goodness of that night. He hoped they had. Then he thought about Harrison. He could almost hear the older man's gravelly voice saying, "You don't talk about decency, you live it." It made him smile faintly. They had gone through something extraordinary together, not as actors, but as men stripped of titles, doing what needed to be done. The world had called it heroic. To them, it had just been right. Keanu reached for his helmet, feeling the warmth of the sun on its surface. He stood again, taking one last look at the stone. The wind picked up slightly, brushing against his jacket and carrying with it the dry scent of dust and distance. He whispered quietly, "Stay alive." It wasn't a prayer. It was a promise to himself, to them, to the world. Then he walked back to his motorcycle, kicked the stand, and started the engine. The low rumble broke the silence for the first time in hours. As he rode off, the horizon opened before him like an invitation. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, glowing in hues of gold and rose beneath the setting sun. The wind tore at his jacket, but he didn't mind. There was peace in the motion, in the simplicity of moving forward. Behind him, the small stone remained a quiet marker in the sand, unseen by most, but enough for the man who left it there. A single word that carried the weight of everything he believed in. Alive. Winter came early that year in Wyoming. Snow blanketed the Tetons, covering the pines in soft white silence. Harrison Ford sat near the wide window of his ranch house, the morning light spilling across the worn wooden table. His reading glasses rested on the bridge of his nose, and in front of him lay an old leather-bound journal. The pages were yellowed at the edges, some corners curled, others smudged with ink from years of weathered thoughts. He didn't write in it often, only when something truly stayed with him. That morning, as a thin column of smoke rose from the fireplace and the sound of wind brushed gently against the windows, he opened to a fresh page. He stared at the blank space for a while, the pen poised above it, before finally pressing down. October 27th. He wrote, in slow, deliberate strokes, Nevada. The night that reminded me what being alive really means. He paused, his breath visible in the cool air, then continued. Keanu moves like water. No rush, no pride, just purpose. The kind of man who doesn't act to be seen, but because it's the only thing that feels right. I've met a lot of people in this business, but very few who carry stillness like that. He leaned back, reading the words over. The fire cracked quietly behind him. Outside, the snow fell in slow, drifting flakes, coating the corral fence and the pine trees beyond. He thought about the desert, the dry wind, the heat, the flicker of firelight against the sand, and how strange it felt now, remembering that place from inside a home surrounded by snow. But the feeling of that night hadn't faded. It never would. It wasn't a movie, he wrote next. There were no cameras, No second takes. Just two people fighting for breath and two men doing what they could to keep it from ending. Funny thing is, for all the decades we've spent pretending to save the world on film, that one night felt more real than all of it put together. He stopped again, rubbing his wrist. The pen's ink glistened slightly in the light. He smiled faintly, thinking of Keanu's quiet determination, the way he'd spoken to the injured woman with the gentleness of a man who had seen pain and refused to let it win. Harrison had admired that kind of calm his whole life, the strength that didn't need to shout. When his wife, Callista, walked into the kitchen, she saw him still sitting there, the journal open. "Writing?" she asked softly. He looked up, smiling, trying to make sense of something. She poured coffee into 2 mugs and brought one to him. "You've been quieter lately," she said. "Different." "Maybe," he said, closing the journal halfway. "Just been thinking about that night, about how fragile everything is." Callista studied him for a moment, then smiled gently. "You've always been a fixer," she said. "Maybe this was life's way of reminding you that you still are." He chuckled softly. Maybe it was. Later that evening, after dinner, Harrison returned to the table. The journal was still open, waiting. The fire had burned low, and the house had grown quiet, except for the steady ticking of the old wall clock. He adjusted his glasses again and kept writing, the pen gliding across the page. "I've been in close calls before flying, filming, bad weather, but nothing like that night. There's something about watching life hang by a thread and realizing you have no script, no direction, just instinct. I used to think heroism was about courage. Now I think it's about stillness. It's about not letting fear decide what happens next." He sat back, thinking about his grandchildren, about the way they looked up at him whenever he told a story from the old days. Most of those stories were about adventure planes, sets, or wild moments from filming. But he knew this one was different. This wasn't for the magazines or the talk shows. This one was for them. When they visited a few weeks later, Harrison sat them down by the fire. The snowstorm outside rattled the windows, and the warmth of the room made their cheeks glow pink. "You ever think about what you'd do if you saw someone in trouble?" he asked. One of his grandsons shrugged. "Call 911, I guess." "That's good," Harrison said, nodding. "But sometimes you're the one standing there before anyone else can come. You don't get to wait for someone to tell you what to do. You just do it." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice low and steady. "You never know when someone will need you, and when that moment comes, you can't hesitate." They listened closely, silent for once, the seriousness in his voice catching them off guard. He smiled a little, softening the weight of it. "That's what I learned out there. Life doesn't wait for scripts. You just have to be ready to act when it counts." Callista watched from the doorway, her arms folded, her eyes shining. Later that night, when the children had gone to bed, she sat beside him on the couch. "You know," she said quietly, "I think that night changed you." Harrison looked into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "It reminded me that the stories we tell aren't as important as the ones we live." He reached over, opened the journal one last time, and wrote his final thought beneath the entry. "Two men who spent their lives pretending to be heroes finally found out what it feels like to be one. It wasn't glory. It wasn't pride. It was just purpose and the quiet grace of doing what's right." He set down the pen, closed the journal, and smiled to himself. Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the land in silence. Inside, a man who had spent decades chasing adventure sat perfectly still, content with one simple truth. Sometimes, the greatest stories never need to be told. It had been months since the desert rescue, and life had returned to its normal rhythm, or so it seemed. The headlines had long since faded, replaced by new stories and new distractions. But for one man, the memory of that dawn in the Nevada desert never left. His name was David Mendoza, a rescue worker for Nye County EMS. He'd been on call that morning, one of the first responders dispatched to the crash. He had seen hundreds of accidents in his 20 years on the job, rollovers, fires, tragedies that stayed burned in the mind. But that night had been different, not because of the danger, but because of what he found when they arrived. David sat for an interview with a small regional paper, the kind that still cared about stories of decency. The reporter, a young woman named Elise, had heard whispers about the rescue, but wanted the truth from someone who had been there. They met in a diner just off the highway near Tonopah, where the smell of coffee and fried eggs filled the air. "So, tell me," Elise asked, notebook open, "what did you see when you prized?" "Got there?" David leaned back, his eyes distant, remembering. "At first, we didn't even realize who they were," he said. "It was still dark, and we were focused on the victims. One guy was kneeling beside the woman, holding her hand, keeping her awake. Another was cutting pieces of cloth to use as splints. They looked like regular people who knew what they were doing." Elise raised an eyebrow. "That was Keanu Reeves and Harrison Ford?" He nodded slowly. "Didn't know it then. Didn't matter either. They weren't standing around waiting for someone else to fix it. They were in it, calm, steady, focused. You could tell they weren't pretending." He paused, taking a sip of coffee before continuing. "I've been in this job a long time. I've seen a lot of different kinds of people on crash scenes. Some panic, some freeze, some just walk away because they don't want to deal with the blood or the smoke. But these two, they were different. They acted like trained responders would. They'd done everything right before we got there, kept the victims warm, stabilized what they could, even made a fire to keep them from going into shock." Elise scribbled notes, leaning closer. "And when you realized who they were," David chuckled, shaking his head, "it was one of the younger guys who recognized them first. He said, 'Hey, isn't that?' And we all looked closer. But Keanu just shook his head and said, 'Focus on them, not us.' We did. They didn't care about being seen. They just wanted those people alive." His tone softened, turning reflective. "When we finally got the victims loaded into the ambulance, they didn't leave right away. They stayed until the helicopter lifted off. Then, once everything was done, they didn't wait for anyone to thank them. They just nodded, climbed on their bikes, and rode off into the sunrise." Elise published the article the next morning. It appeared on the front page of the Flast, Nevada Free Press, under the title, "Rescue Worker Speaks on Desert Heroes." It wasn't written like a tabloid story. There were no exclamation marks, no sensational headlines, just a clear, honest account from a man who had seen something rare. David Mendoza's words were quoted in full. "When we arrived, we didn't even realize who they were. Keanu was kneeling beside the victims, holding one's hand. Harrison was cutting cloth for a splint. They acted like any trained responder would. No cameras, no entourage, no spotlight. That line alone was enough to capture the world's attention. Within hours, the story was picked up by major outlets. But it wasn't framed as celebrity gossip. It was told as a reminder that kindness didn't need a headline to matter." In his interview, David had gone on to say something that struck a deeper chord. "I've been in this job for 20 years, he said. "I've seen a lot of people freeze up. I've seen some folks who run away because they can't stomach it. And I've seen others, regular people, who give everything they have for a stranger. These two men, they didn't talk, they didn't pose, they just worked. They stayed until the helicopter left. Then they got on their bikes and rode off into the sunrise." That statement went viral, shared millions of times within days. Clips of the interview spread across social media. People replayed that last sentence over and over, calling it the most cinematic exit ever. But what really stayed with them wasn't the image, it was the humility. The idea that two men who had spent decades in front of cameras would disappear quietly after doing something extraordinary. The sheriff's office later confirmed every detail. Photos from the rescue scene surfaced, grainy shots taken by a junior medic. In them, Keanu was seen crouched beside a stretcher, his hands covered in dust, his expression focused. Harrison stood beside him, holding a roll of gauze. Neither looked at the camera. Neither seemed to care who was watching. The article reached beyond entertainment circles. Teachers printed it out for their students, calling it a lesson in humility. Veterans groups shared it on forums as an example of duty without recognition. Even first responders across the country commented, saying, "That's how it's supposed to be done." For a brief moment, the noise of the world paused. The story reminded people of something simple, that goodness still existed, even when it wasn't performed for applause. David Mendoza would later say in a follow-up interview, "I didn't tell that story to make them famous. I told it because it made me believe again. I've seen the worst of people on bad days. But that morning, I saw the best. And it wasn't scripted. It was real. And just like that, the myth became truth. A quiet act of kindness that outshone the bright lights of fame." By spring, the story had faded from headlines, but not from hearts. Something about it had stuck. The image of two men, both icons of cinema, kneeling in the dirt to save strangers, had stirred something deeper than celebrity admiration. It reminded people that kindness wasn't out of reach. That heroism didn't always wear capes or cameras. It could live in anyone, on any road, at any moment. The first ripple began in Nevada, near Tonopah. A group of motorcyclists who had read the story decided to organize a charity ride through the same desert stretch where the crash had happened. They weren't affiliated with any fan club or studio. They just wanted to do something meaningful. The idea spread online through biker forums and community pages. Within weeks, riders from across the state, veterans, mechanics, students, even families joined the cause. They called the event the Desert Signal Ride. Its mission was simple: raise funds for rural rescue stations, supply remote highways with emergency kits, and remind travelers never to pass someone in need. On the morning of the first ride, more than 100 bikes gathered at dawn near the highway's edge. The air was crisp, the horizon painted in gold. The riders didn't play music or carry banners with celebrity names. Instead, taped to many windshields were the same three words, handwritten on white paper: "Be someone's signal." The phrase came from something David Mendoza, the rescue worker, had said in his interview. When asked what people could learn from that night, he had replied, "You might not be able to save the world, but you can be someone's signal when they're lost." Those words struck a chord. The ride made its way across the desert, the thunder of engines echoing through the open plains. Along the way, volunteers stopped to place small jugs of water along the route for stranded travelers and animals. Others left first aid kits in marked boxes along the road. The sheriff's office later reported fewer heat-related incidents that summer than any year before. News of the ride spread quickly. Soon, other groups picked up the idea: rescue drives in Arizona, community aid events in Utah, and small fundraisers in Texas, all inspired by that same moment in the Nevada desert. None of them carried Keanu's or Harrison's endorsement, but their influence was everywhere. Clara and Luke Spencer even joined one of the rides that fall. Luke's arm had healed, though he still wore a brace, and Clara's limp was barely noticeable. They didn't draw attention to themselves, but when someone recognized them, they shared their story quietly, reminding others that help could come from anyone. Clara carried a small stone in her pocket with the word "alive" etched into it, the one she and Luke had made after visiting the site months before. The following year, the movement grew beyond the desert. What began as a single ride in Nevada became a network of small grassroots events, stretching across the country. Riders in Oregon organized a coastal signal run to raise funds for volunteer fire departments. A group in Kansas launched a Highway Heart project, placing first aid kits in rest stops and teaching travelers basic emergency response. Even overseas, in Canada and Australia, groups took up the idea: people helping strangers, because two men once chose to stop instead of pass by. And through it all, Keanu and Harrison stayed silent. They didn't attend the rides. They didn't issue statements. They didn't need to. The movement didn't depend on them. It depended on the spirit they had embodied. That, perhaps, was what made it so powerful. At a charity event in Los Angeles months later, Keanu was asked about it during a Q&A. The moderator mentioned the rides, the banners, the communities forming in their honor. Keanu shifted slightly in his chair, eyes lowering for a moment before he answered. "I think what people are doing out there," he said, "it's beautiful. But it's not about me. It's about all of us. You don't need a camera to be a hero. You just need heart." The audience fell silent. The words weren't rehearsed. They weren't polished or wrapped in metaphor. They were just true. That line spread faster than any quote from a press junket or movie premiere. Teachers used it in classrooms. First responders printed it on bulletin boards. Motorcycle clubs made stickers with it and handed them out during community rides. You don't need a camera to be a hero. You just need heart. It became a motto that outlived the story that had birthed it. Back in Nevada, the original Desert Signal ride continued every year. The local sheriff's department helped coordinate routes, ensuring safety for hundreds of bikers who came from all over the country to ride under the same sunrise where everything had begun. Each year, someone would stop at the exact place where the crash had occurred. There was no monument, just a small, weathered stone by the roadside. No one knew who had placed it there or when. But those who stopped to look saw one word carved into the surface: alive. Over time, it became the unofficial symbol of the movement, a word that reminded people why they rode, why they stopped, why they cared. Some carried replicas on their keychains. Others tattooed it over their hearts. It wasn't about fame. It was about life and the simple, quiet duty to protect it. In a world filled with noise, the movement stood for something rare: stillness, empathy, and action without expectation. And all of it began with two men who never asked for recognition. They simply chose to act when it mattered most. The desert still holds their silence, but the world carries their echo. The desert remembers. Long after the headlines faded and the cameras turned elsewhere, that stretch of highway in Nevada still carried the echo of what happened that night. The same wind that once whipped through broken glass and twisted metal now moved gently across the sand, smoothing away the scars, but not the story. Beneath the vast sky, it felt as if the earth itself had held on to the memory. Two men who could have kept driving, but didn't. When travelers passed that road now, some slowed down, drawn by the faint shimmer of something unseen. Maybe it was the heat, maybe it was the history. Those who stopped often noticed the small stone by the roadside, weathered but still legible. One word carved into it: alive. They didn't know who had put it there, but they didn't need to. It spoke for itself. Keanu Reeves never returned to that spot publicly, but he carried it with him. Every interview, every movie, every charity event afterward bore the quiet influence of that night. He once said during a fundraiser, "The world doesn't always need to see what's good. It just needs more of it." He meant it. He had lived it. Harrison Ford, too, found his pace changing. He still flew his planes and still acted in films. But friends noticed he was different. Quieter. Gentler. He would sometimes tell his grandchildren about that night, though never using names. "There's a kind of courage that doesn't make noise," he told them. "And when you find it, you'll know." The two men never sought praise for what they did. They didn't speak of the rescue again, didn't attend award ceremonies, or comment on the viral stories. The rescue workers' interview, the charity rides, the photos, all became part of a growing legend, one neither of them had tried to build. Yet, the beauty of it was that the legend didn't glorify them. It glorified decency itself. Under the same sky where it had all begun, time moved on. The desert turned gold at dawn, silver at dusk, and black under the stars. Somewhere along that highway, the wind carried whispers of that night, the crackle of fire, the quiet reassurances, the heartbeat that kept fighting. And in that stillness, there lingered a reminder that true heroism doesn't shine under spotlights. It burns quietly in the dark, waiting for a moment to act. As the years passed, the story took on a life of its own, told in hushed tones around campfires and retold in classrooms as a lesson about empathy. Students watched news clips, listening to the rescue worker's voice, describing that night. And teachers would pause to ask, "What would you have done?" That question, simple yet powerful, became a spark for reflection. Not everyone can rescue someone from a burning car. Not everyone will face a moment of life or death in the desert. But every person, at some point, is given a choice. A moment when doing nothing is easy, and doing something takes heart. That was the true legacy of that night. Not just the lives saved, but the example left behind. The Nevada highway where it happened was eventually fitted with new signage, warning drivers of soft shoulders and dangerous turns. Locals began calling it the Signal Road, though it never appeared on maps. It was an unspoken tribute, one carried by those who lived nearby. Truckers would honk their horns as they passed the site. Motorcyclists slowed their engines, tipping their heads in silence. Even tourists who had heard of the story stopped for a few moments to take in the stillness, the horizon stretching endlessly, as if the desert itself had paused to remember. Every so often, someone would leave a note beneath the alive stone. Some were prayers, some were thank yous, some were promises to pay it forward. No one ever claimed ownership of those gestures. They simply appeared and disappeared with the wind, carried away like the firelight from that night so long ago. For Keanu Reeves, the memory became a compass, a quiet reminder of what truly mattered beyond the screens and scripts. He continued his philanthropy, often anonymously, helping people who would never know his name. When asked years later why he stayed so private about acts of charity, he said softly, "Goodness doesn't need to announce itself. It just needs to exist." Harrison Ford, too, carried the moment with him. During interviews in his later years, he would speak more about human decency than about Hollywood. "You live long enough," he once said, "and you learn that the world isn't saved by speeches or special effects. It's saved by people who stop when someone needs them." In the end, the desert held the memory of one silent night when fame met humanity. When two men, known across the world for their roles as heroes, lived up to those ideals not in front of a camera, but under a sky full of stars, beside a fire made from scraps and hope. As the sun sets over that same stretch of Nevada highway, the wind still carries traces of that night. The sound of engines, the flicker of flames, and the steady rhythm of two hearts refusing to give up. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of a voice saying, "We're right. Here, you're gonna make it." Because sometimes, the most incredible stories aren't written for movies. They happen in the quiet, in the heat, in the dark, when no one is watching. They are lived, not performed. And they remind us that courage still breathes in ordinary souls who choose to act. So as this story closes, ask yourself when the moment comes, will you stop? Will you lend your hand, your voice, your strength? If you believe that real heroes still walk among us, share this story and tell us in the comments. Have you ever witnessed an act of quiet heroism that restored your faith in humanity? Because somewhere out there, someone might be waiting for a signal. And maybe, just maybe, that signal could be you.